And he introduced this idea into Western science without ever mentioning the word consciousness. Very tricky. Huh? Because, you know, of course, in Einstein's theory of relativity states, special relativity states, that the speed of light is always constant. And that time, or length, whichever way you want to measure it, adjusts automatically between two coordinate systems that are in motion relative to one another, so that the speed of light remains constant. See? So everybody thought, oh, this is about the speed of light. No, no. This is about consciousness. What he's saying, that an observer at motion relative to another observer always observes that the speed of light remains constant. Why? Then the rest of the theory is about why and how and all of that. So everybody gets hung up on all that stuff, and they fail to notice the assumption. The assumption in Einstein's theory is that there are two observers. Duh. Nobody looks at the assumption. They're all involved in all the mechanics, right? Typical German Western intelligence. Get all hung up in the gears, and they forget the source of power. So the assumptions in any theory actually determine the outcome, the conclusions. I know you have a bunch of misunderstood terms in here, but I'm trying to get an idea across. Everybody starts fidgeting. As soon as you start talking about something they don't really understand. Anyway, this is very clear to me that the assumptions, the structural assumptions of a theory actually determine the conclusion. Vikram, pay attention. So if you assume that then the starting conditions of Einstein's theory is that there are two observers at relative motion to one another. But what is an observer? An observer has to be a conscious being, right? Without the presence of the observer, none of this has any meaning. So in the assumptions, Einstein slipped in the idea of consciousness being absolute, and all these physical quantities such as velocity, you know, the speed of light and all this stuff are actually determined by the presence of the observer. If there's, you know, if the tree falls in the forest and nobody hears it, then, you know, who knows if it really happened or not. The presence of the observer is crucial. Otherwise, you don't have an experiment. You don't have the conditions necessary to verify the theory. You know, even if you know, like recently they did some experiments with satellites that verified some of Einstein's calculations. Well, that's very nice. You can have a satellite take the measurement, but still, some human being has to sit down and say, well, this is what it means, right? You have a whole column of numbers from some instrument. Well, what's the meaning of it? You see? So without the presence of the conscious being, you don't have a theory, you don't have science, you don't have anything. You know, just a bunch of rocks rattling around in space. So the Vedic technology was aware of these things long before Western science even started to formulate any ideas such as this. Quantum mechanics, of course, is built on the assumptions of Einstein's theory. And quantum mechanics is absolutely dependent on consciousness. Although, you know, they try to avoid the subject as much as possible, a bunch of physicists. But Einstein's theory has been verified in almost all of its details very thoroughly. And quantum mechanics has also been extremely successful at predicting physical phenomena. So actually now the notion of consciousness, and especially of consciousness or the act of measurement or perception itself, collapsing the universal quantum wave function into a specific manifestation is quite well established in Western science. And of course, this same idea is extremely prominent in the Vedic literature, especially Vedanta Sutra. Vedanta Sutra talks extensively about consciousness, different states of consciousness, dreams, sleep, you know, waking consciousness, super consciousness, all this stuff. And I came across these ideas when I did my research for the Vedanta Sutra commentary. Finally, we're at a point where Western knowledge and Vedic knowledge can have a dialogue. But it would have to be on the highest level of both of them. And so far, it hasn't really gotten much momentum. Primarily because the scientists are still in denial about consciousness. Oh, it's just some epiphenomenon of brain function, and, you know, a bunch of neurons firing off, and you just think you're conscious. What's the difference? If I think I'm conscious, I am conscious, right? Duh. Of course. Yeah, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. Well, how do you know you're thinking? You have to be conscious. So it's like, I think, therefore I'm conscious.
Behind closed doors, they all kind of believe that there is this consciousness. The only thing is, in the open, they don't come out.
Right, because their job depends on creating the illusion that there's no such thing as spiritual life. See, the scientist's job, you think the scientist's job is to discover stuff? No. The scientist's job is to convince the people in general that there's no such thing as spiritual life. That's their actual job. And if they don't do that job, they get fired. They can't publish any papers, you know. Peer-reviewed science is one of the biggest scams in the world today, because all it is a propaganda campaign to convince people that there is no such thing as spiritual life. That's all. I mean, yeah, they invent a few neat gadgets, you know, but those gadgets only get developed if they disempower people in general. See? So anyway, I don't want to get into that too much. All right, now we're trying to celebrate Krishna's appearance. So Krishna appears to introduce the Yuga Dharma, to set up the conditions for the transition to Kali Yuga, which is basically the Battle of Kurukshetra. Think about it for a minute. In the Battle of Kurukshetra, all the Kshatriyas, all the kings in the world were slaughtered. The only survivors were the Pandavas. Everybody else was killed. And you can read how Duryodhana, in setting up his army, he brought in allies from all over the world. There were kings from South America, North America, all over Asia, you know, Australia. He even got kings coming from other places in the Bhumandala, not on Earth. Yeah. So there was something like, I don't know, 18 million troops involved in the battle, more than that even. And in 18 days they were all slaughtered. So you could imagine today what would happen if, you know, they had one of those G20 meetings and somebody dropped a nuke on them, you know, and all the leaders of the world were gone just like that. Just imagine what a huge power vacuum that would create, and how much confusion and chaos, and probably wars would start over it, and so many things would happen as a consequence. There would be economic dislocation and all kinds of problems. So at the end of the Dvapara Yuga, the Battle of Kurukshetra took place, and all of the kings of the world were wiped out, and their armies. So all of a sudden the world was without leaders. And then, just to put the icing on the cake, a few years later, Krishna left the planet. He turned off the Vedic technology that worked by mantras. So even if someone had the training, that they could manifest things by mantra, it wouldn't work anymore. We read in the first canto of Bhagavatam that Arjuna was escorting Krishna's queens after the battle of after Krishna left the planet. Arjuna went and he took Krishna's queens and he was taking them to a safe place. And they were attacked by cowherd men. And for Arjuna, that's just like, you know, swatting a fly, right? But Arjuna was defeated by the cowherds because his astras wouldn't work anymore. His divine weapons, his mantra-powered weapons, stopped working. So it would be the equivalent of, in our society, if we woke up one morning and nothing electrical worked anymore. I mean, nothing. Cars, computers, telephone, nothing like if Krishna changed the value of conductance or something like that, and then the next morning